This is the Fighter Pilot Podcast, episode 60. This week, we cut straight to the interview with a distinguished visitor calling in from the other side of the planet to discuss the first Russian aircraft to be featured on the show, the Mig-29 Fulcrum. And stick around because after the interview, a former podcast guest returns to share his thoughts on what it was like to train against a Fulcrum in his trusty FA-18 Hornet. Hit it.
Strap in for the Fighter Pilot Podcast, the internet radio show that explores the fascinating world of air combat, the aircraft, the weapon systems, and most importantly, the people. Now, here's your host, retired U.S. Navy fighter pilot, Vincent Aiello.
Well, those of you who have listened to the Fighter Pilot Podcast a while know that when the show is graced with a distinguished visitor, we omit the chit-chat, announcements, and listener questions, and instead cut straight to the interview. Well, that is the case on this episode because dialing in all the way from central India is a high-ranking gentleman with extensive aviation experience. He joined the Indian Air Force in 1966 and trained as a fighter pilot, seeing action in the 1971 Indo-Pak War. He downed a Pakistani F-86 Sabre in his very first engagement while flying a Hawker Hunter, his first operational aircraft. He went on to fly a variety of aircraft, including the Su-7 Fitter, Mig-29 Fishbed, and even various transports and helicopters. He inducted the Mig-29 Fulcrum and Su-30 Flanker into the Indian Air Force, was a Mig-29 demonstration pilot, and was an instructor pilot both at the academy level and TACDE, the Indian Air Force Top Gun equivalent. Over a 40-year career, he served all over India as well as abroad in a number of field and staff assignments. He is a staff college graduate and instructor and is an alumnus of the Air War College in the United States. He retired in 2006, settling down in Mao in central India, where he is currently occupied writing on his experiences and views on national security matters. Ladies and gentlemen, listeners of the Fighter Pilot Podcast, it is my honor to introduce and welcome to the show Air Marshal Harish Masand, call sign either Kopay or Fulcrum 1, and we'll get to that in just a little bit. But Air Marshal, hello and welcome to the show, sir.
Oh, hi there, Vincent. Yeah, pleasure talking to you. And that's a long introduction, I must say. I'm humbled.
All right. I definitely had more to work with, but we're going to get to that. And I'm really excited to have you on the show. So thanks for dialing in. And I think we're about as far apart in the world as we can get. It's 9:30 p.m. for me, and I believe it's 10 a.m. for you?
Yeah, it's 10 o'clock in the morning. Yeah, for me.
Okay. All right. So an air marshal is the equivalent of a 3-star admiral or general here in the West. But I think you said once that your favorite time was the mid-grades where you were flying mostly, huh?
Yeah. In the early days when I was flying as a flight lieutenant or a captain level, those were the most exciting flying days, actually.
Okay.
Because you had a lot of fun, yeah.
Air Marshal, we could certainly talk about any number of the many aircraft you flew, but today I'd like to focus on the Mig-29 Fulcrum, if that's okay.
Yep, okay.
So here on the show, we have what we're calling the aircraft series, and we go through a litany of different questions. And so let's just start right at the beginning. Could you tell us what the Mig-29 Fulcrum was designed to do?
Well, I think in the Russian Air Force, they designed it more as a lightweight air superiority fighter, basically. About the same time it was being developed, about the same time when you had the YF-16 and YF-17 competition going on for the lightweight fighter in the U.S. It's about the same time. So flew around 78 or 79 for the first time, as I remember. And we got it in the Indian Air Force in 1986, 87. We trained on that. There were 2 aircraft actually being developed by the Soviet Union at that time. One was the Ram-M, which was the MiG-29 later, the Fulcrum, right? And the other one was the bigger one by the Sukhoi Design Bureau, the Su-30, called the Ram-L in the earlier satellite photographs.
And that became the Su-27 family of flankers?
That's right.
Okay.
Yes.
And India ended up with both of those.
Well, yes. Yeah, right. We started with a MiG-29 in, like I said, in the mid-'80s. And in the mid-'90s, we signed up for the twin-seater version of the Su-27, that's the Su-30,
Right.
upgraded to Indian standards called the Su-30 MKI.
That's right. Modified for export to India, as I recall.
That's right.
So with the MiG-29, you call it an air superiority fighter. Was it also designed initially with some air-to-surface capability, or they added that later?
Well, very rudimentary right in the beginning. I mean, they had this capability because they had the weapons. I mean, basically all free-fall, unguided weapons. But I don't think the Russians or the Indians initially intended to employ the MiG-29 for that role. So it specialized in the air superiority role. And while we had those weapons like bombs and rockets and things like that, unguided ones, the Indian Air Force never used it for that role at all, right from the start. Later in the recent years, when we've upgraded the MiG-29, it's got some great stuff, including, sensors for air-to-surface operations like the radar and laser and other things. And it's got precision-guided munitions, so now it has true multi-role capability.
Well, so to be fair, it was built during the Cold War, right? And it was, as you said, a counter to the American teen fighters, we can call them, the 14, 15, 16, 18. And it was intended as well to be very rugged in case the Cold War went hot. It had to either move forward or back. So we'll talk about that in a little bit with some of the design characteristics. But like you said, it was designed in a time when aircraft were designed really to do one thing. And in this case, it was air-to-air.
Yep, you're right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that being said, is there a particular air-to-air role that it does well? I always thought of the MiG-29, and you might tell me I'm wrong, but with its relatively limited fuel capacity, particularly compared to the Su-27 family, I always thought of it as maybe a defensive or point fighter, something very close to its home base. Would you say that was accurate, or was it able to get out and go a decent distance?
Well, in the initial versions of the Fulcrum that we got, the MiG-29s that we got, you're right, had limited internal fuel and carried just one drop tank of 1,500 liters under the belly in between the two engines. That gave it some range, but not as much as the Su-27 or the other Western fighters, certainly. But then, within about 200 kilometers of the battlefield, it could do all that with this fuel. The later versions that we got, a few years later, had three tanker versions. There were two wing tanks of 1,100 liters each, and that added to the range, of course, by taking up two stations.
Sure.
But in the air superiority role, I mean, you don't want to carry 10 missiles, I would say. I mean, just 4 or 6 of different mix, good enough.
Yes.
Really, if you're going to get, because you're not going to stay in combat forever, really. So all the extra ammunition that you're carrying is just load. That increased the range of the aircraft with the three-tanker version. And now with the upgraded version, we got even more internal fuel and air-to-air refueling capabilities. So that puts the aircraft back into the game in terms of, pretty good range wherever you want to operate, yeah.
And one thing that's interesting about the MiG-29 compared to even, let's say, the Eagle, which was a little before it, but let's say the F-16, is some of the different avionics that were built into it from the beginning. So we had the infrared search and track that had an integrated laser, and we had a pilot-mounted cueing well before we had that in the West.
You're right, absolutely. And at that particular time in the 80s, when we got it with a powerful radar, with the infrared search and track, as you mentioned, which we call the OLS, and of course the helmet-mounted sight, not just a display, just a basic cueing sight, all coordinated and slew to the missiles on board. It gave it tremendous capability in terms of, dogfighting or close combat or whatever, to lock on and launch without wasting too much time.
Right.
And that capability didn't come into Western fighters till much, much later, I think.
Right. Well, in typical fashion, if you'll think of it this way, the Soviets came up with something basic and reliable, and it worked. And the West took 20 extra years, but made something extravagant like you might see in a science fiction movie. So, I guess it's a question of what mindset you want to take. But
yeah, and far more expensive.
Oh, yes, true. Mm-hmm. And heavier and harder on the neck,
sure.
Which is, of course, an issue for those of us who fly a lot. No, to your point, though, so I used to be the threat aircraft, and it's funny to think of the MiG-29 as a threat when we're sitting here having a very cordial discussion. But as a Top Gun instructor in 2000, and at the time, the Fulcrum was the threat. We considered it the main threat to the MiG-29, although the Su-27 was certainly there, but we just didn't think of it as quite as proliferated. We got to know the aircraft quite well and some of the weapon systems. We're going to talk about that today. But yeah, the helmet, as you stated, with the high off-boresight capability of what we would call the AA-11 Archer is quite a formidable capability. I mean, now we have the joint helmet and the AIM-9X, but prior to that, the Archer was the big boy on the block.
True, yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay. Well, let's talk about the variants, and you've already touched on them a little bit, and here's where we have to kind of think of the two sides, because we have the indigenous nomenclature and then we also have the NATO nomenclature. Now, I imagine you're familiar with both, but let's start with what we would call the Fulcrum A, and I believe, was that the MiG-29S or just the plain old MiG-29?
Well, no, that was just the MiG-29, I mean, A or B or C,
okay.
I mean, as we call it here. Quite frankly, there are very, very minor differences in the versions in terms of the avionics, basically. The S and the SM and the SK versions came a little later when the Russians tried to move towards what they later called the MiG-29M, the truly multi-role and rigged up aircraft with glass cockpit and other things which they tried to sell. So I would say that one of the S versions was a fatback version, which had, which we call the fatback because it had more internal fuel, and it's in the upgraded version now, where from the canopy.
The spine.
The spine was all filled with fuel, basically. So those are the versions, and I think the MiG-29M would be closer to the Fulcrum E, as you call it, in the West.
Right.
Right, and all the other variants of A, B, C, D would fit into somewhere between, S and SK.
Right.
Now, unfortunately, most of these aircraft didn't see service, really. I mean, they were developed and, kind of used here and there, but didn't really see service in large numbers.
And as I recall, so you have the letter that follows the MiG-29, and that was typically some sort of Russian word that affected or influenced or changed the aircraft. And then in the West, of course, they would give it that NATO designation. So yeah, to your point, the Fulcrum A was your baseline operational fighter. And then the Fulcrum B, I believe you called that what? The MiG-29 UB? That was your two-seat variant.
Uba in Russian, yeah.
Okay, yeah. And that did not have a radar.
Well, it didn't have a radar, yeah. To accommodate the second pilot, didn't carry a radar.
Right.
It carried the OLS, the infrared search and track, and almost everything else. It had the same internal fuel, could carry the same external tanks, go as far, but without the radar, yeah.
Right. And then, like you stated, the Fulcrum C had the larger dorsal or spine with the fuel. I believe it had an integrated electronic attack system as well, if I remember correctly. And then the Fulcrum D, I believe, was the naval variant. But I don't think India didn't have any of those, correct?
No, the Indians got the MiG-29K, which is the naval version later. Much later, I think.
Oh.
Yeah. Our Indian Navy operates one carrier just now with the whole squadron of MiG-29Ks. Yeah.
Okay. And K in this case stands for carrier.
Yeah.
But in this particular variant, we'll have what? Upgraded landing gear, so it's stronger with a hook.
Absolutely.
And folding wings, and I believe an extra weapon station on each wing.
Yes, and extra fuel and other things, the modification that came with later, the M version. Yeah, something like that.
Now, did you get to fly one of those, or were those only in the Indian Navy? Or how does that work?
No. The Indian Navy got it after I retired, and so I never got to fly that.
Okay. I wonder, though, I'm guessing you could have jumped right in and taken off?
Well, I could even now because I remember it backwards. I mean, everything in the 29 is so familiar.
Yeah.
And God's been very kind that my back is holding up so I can still haul G, and, my eyes are still okay. So
oh boy.
I would love to fly, but unfortunately nobody would get me into the cockpit. But I was very fortunate, 3 years after retirement in 2009. I mean, I was like 63 or something at that time. Uh-huh. And the Russians were displaying the MiG-35, which is like a modified version, which carries a little more export version again of the M, but without thrust vectoring. They were displaying it in Bangalore in one of our air shows over the Aero India, and they invited me to fly it. And I hadn't flown a fighter for something like 4 years by then.
And they just let you jump in and go?
I mean, it was two-seater, fortunately, but the guy just sort of, put me in the front cockpit and said, okay, start up. and then let me do everything because he was just kind of watching from the back.
Yeah.
And the Russian test pilot, and he's quite happy with the way I flew it because I did everything. I did the Cobra. Now this had a fly-by-wire control, so I could do the Cobra more easily on that than on in the other A versions, which had the manual control and they had the stick pusher coming in between, once in a while. We could do the tail slide on the previous version very well, which I used to display. But this one, I could switch off the wire, fly-by-wire, and do a Cobra comfortably. So it was fun.
Okay. And I think we call that one the Fulcrum F. But getting back to that, when the MiG-29 debuted in India, I think you told me before we recorded that you were doing demonstrations in front of audiences and military personnel with something like 15 or 20 hours is all in the airplane?
Yeah, you're right. Because, frankly, when I got into the 29 in Russia, and actually I published that article, the first trip that I did on it, I felt I was in a Hunter again all over. Because it flies... the controls are as light, the visibility is the same. If you compare the rate of climb in dry power, the rate of turn at 10,000 feet in dry power, everything was like a Hunter. And you put on the burner, it became a Super Hunter. So I wrote an article called The MiG-29 as a Super Hunter and published it then. It's available on the net even now.
Oh, okay.
So when I flew the 29, I felt very comfortable. And as we came back naturally, in 87, June, we started taking deliveries of these aircraft in India after assembly. And obviously, our bosses were very keen on displaying this aircraft. So they asked me, I said, what do you think the aircraft can do? And I had a profile ready. And within about 20 hours, I was kind of displaying this aircraft for our shows here and there. And of course, I went about it very gradually. You didn't do everything first time. The tail slide and the others came a little later with more experience. But, all the other maneuvers you could do right from the beginning. Yeah.
Right. Well, and to be fair, 20 hours is probably quite a bit more than 20 flights, right? In other words, these flights were fairly short.
I would say about 35, 40 missions, by then. Yeah.
Because not only is it not carry a bunch of fuel, but also you're using it very quickly, depending on whether you're doing a demonstration practice or air-to-air missions or something along those lines.
We could fly the aircraft at altitude for cruise and other things like escort missions for an hour and a half or even longer with the tank. But I felt when I inducted the aircraft that, the life of the aircraft is precious. Every minute on the aircraft that you log is burning up some life of it. And so therefore, we used to start training, where we climbed out to our operating area. As soon as we got there inside, we did our engagements or whatever the set situations that we had. And on the way back, we were regrouping and descending and landing. So most of my combat training missions were like 25 minutes, 20 minutes. And my display missions were 8 and 10 minutes.
Oh, wow. That's not a lot of time in the airplane, and it takes quite a few flights to get very many hours.
Yeah.
Okay.
But, like in 8, 10 minutes or 25 minutes, you hold 8-9G a few times and, you did everything. You were always with maneuvering the aircraft. There was no time to be really straight and level and just hang around and waste time. Right. So that gave you a lot of experience.
Did you mostly do your demonstrations in India, or did you travel outside?
No. Those days we didn't have this policy of taking a foreign aircraft outside to display it. We displayed the MiG-29 all over in India,
Now, what can you tell us about why it looks the way it does? At some point, someone decided to make it a twin engine and twin tail, and of course, single pilot for the most part, of course, 2-seaters as required. And we alluded to this a little bit with the Cold War scenario, but it does have a fairly unique appearance. What can you tell us about it?
Yeah, what I gathered from the designer, actually, Mr. Belyakov, the chief designer, Ratislav R.A. Belyakov. I spoke to him extensively later when he came and visited us, and much later in the MiG-21 biz upgrade. And what I gathered from him was that they wanted to make an aircraft where even the fuselage, the body was a lifting body. So they kind of gave it a sort of a curved shape, almost like a Cobra. A hooded Cobra. So when the aircraft taxis out, the first time when we saw the aircraft on the nose wheel, when it pumps up a little down if you use the brakes, it almost looks like a Cobra, trying to strike. So it's a great design. Of course, the finish, I must admit over here that if you stand up close to a 29 and park it next to an F-16 or a Mirage 2000 or any of these Western aircraft, you will find that the finish of the aircraft is not quite the same as the other Western aircraft. It's a little rugged, kind of crude. It's got a little wavy surface, and some of the rivets and other things are visible. But then again, Mr. Beliako said, why waste money on this? Because these are the things that actually prevent the air from breaking up at high angles of attack. This is amazing, actually. So they made it simpler, they made it more rugged, and they got some benefit out of it.
Sure.
Of course, a little extra drag, form drag, naturally, and that works on the range and the radius of action a little bit. But you could compensate.
Well, everything
for
is
that.
a trade-off,
Yeah.
as we like to say in aircraft, and as in with many things in life. Did you ever have a chance to have situations, as you put it? That's an interesting word, but to either dogfight or train with F-16s or Mirage?
No, unfortunately, no.
Oh, okay.
Remember, I went into the 29 as a squadron commander, so I had about 2 years tenure on there. That's it. Then I moved on and, got kicked upstairs, put on my next rank and moved on to other jobs. So
Right.
operations officer, where I continued to fly the MiG-29s with the 3rd Squadron, yes. But then, when I became 1-star, and then all kinds of staff jobs, I didn't get to fly. So those days, actually, we weren't even exercising with the Americans and Red Flag and the others like today's people are. The Americans come over and the Su-30s and the MiG-29s and the MiG-21s have been participating in that. All that started, I think, around 2004 or 5. So
Right as you were ready to retire.
Yeah, just about retiring. So I never got into those.
Okay. How many hours did you end up with in the MiG-29? And again, I realize it's different than how many missions, but...
I've got just under 500 hours, but I would say more than 1,000 missions.
Okay.
On the 29.
So the average less than half an hour. Yeah. How many flight hours total in your 40 years of experience?
I've got about 3,000 flying hours. And back again, I say, in the earlier aircraft also, so I've got about 6,000, 5,000, 6,000 missions total, but about 3,000 hours, yeah.
That is impressive. Getting back to the way it looks, there's some sort of intake covers when the aircraft is on the ground. Is that correct? And is that for unprepared surfaces, or what can you tell us about that?
These are called FOD, or foreign object damage doors, and they are closed on the ground, and they only open up when you raise the nose wheel at about 200 kilometers indicated
on
speed before takeoff.
Okay.
And they're meant for that, and they again close the same way, when you return and land. And they're meant for that. Unfortunately, I would be very honest that we did have some problems with the foreign object damage, despite the doors, not while it was taxiing or taking off, but I would say that if there was some rubble on the surface operating surface and you raised the nose wheel at that time and the nose wheel still carried a little bit of the rubble, and as the intakes open, it tended to go in. But we got over that pretty quickly, because we devised a method where we actually didn't lower the nose wheel on landing at all until the intakes were completely closed. Oh. That gave us aerodynamic braking as well.
Right.
So we didn't have to use the tail chute with it. We hardly used brakes to stop on a normal runway. But you could land short, do short landings, on unprepared fields. And generally you got away. More of a problem actually on the engine was internal object damage. I don't know, at that particular time when we were getting the 29, the Soviet Union was in a disarray, and I would say that, sometimes there were bolts left behind or things left behind inside in the intake. Sometimes, bolts from the intake system or rivets popped out and went in. But those problems, as the years went along, the Russians hardened the system and we also kind of overcame.
Right.
To talk about the ruggedness, if you give me a minute, I would just like to mention this.
Sure.
I remember when we came back from a mission and my number 2, my wingman, the ground crew found that his right engine was completely meshed up with some damage, and we didn't know what it was. And later we found that it was one of the internal objects. So somewhere down in the flight it flew and completely mangled his blade. So I remember asking him and saying, did you notice any crunching noise or grinding noise? Or he said, no. So I said, all right, did you notice that you needed a couple of % more power on this engine to keep it, kind of level, and trim in yaw? And he said, actually, I needed 2% more on the other engine. So I said, in jest, I mean, in joke, of course, I said, I think we should throw a bolt into every engine. It works better, obviously.
I don't think the maintenance personnel would appreciate that. But, oh, heavens. So very rugged and built to withstand a lot of not neglect, but abuse, maybe is the word I want.
Well, I would say damage, not abuse. I mean, no system in the world can take abuse. And I keep saying that
No, that's true.
to people, that you handle your aircraft just like you handle everything else, your cars and others, with care, and they last forever. And I'm very proud to say that, like, I've got 1,000 missions on the 29. And I had some great technicians and all. They all became very friends, and we worked as a team. In those 1,000 missions, I've never had one single failure on the 29. As a matter of fact, in the entire Air Force and everything that I flew, I've never ejected. I've never had to go through any of these things. Even in wars, I'm very fortunate, actually. If you look after your assets, they work well.
And that is a lesson beyond just aviation, I would say.
Oh, yeah, everything.
Speaking of the flying, let's get back to that a little bit. You said it was a real joy to fly it. Was it pilot intensive? Was the hands-on throttle and stick good? Or did you find that it was comfortable or that you had to look inside to find switches? What was it like to fly the MiG-29?
I found it very easy to fly, frankly, and quite, like I said, compared to the earlier Su-7s and the MiG-21s that I had flown, Russian designs, this had a lot more on the throttle and stick. I wouldn't say it was completely hot ass, as we call it, but almost everything was on the throttle and stick that you wanted to do, except for some radar and armament switches that you had to select. And those were conveniently placed at eye level, just left of the head-up display, the HUD. So it wasn't difficult. Now, I always believe that you fly fighters. I mean, you're a fighter pilot, so you fly fighters not by looking inside at the instruments. You fly it by feel, and then you check whether you're actually doing it correctly, with a glance inside. Mm-hmm. That's the way I used to fly it, and I found it always worked. And that's the way I try to teach my youngsters, to use the 29 to its limits. Because, while training, I mean, you make a little mistake, you lose 100 feet or gain 200 feet. In fighter flying, who gives,
right.
too much about it, really? I don't want to use any four-letter words over here. So who gives anything about it? I mean, 100, 200 feet in fighter flying in combat. But then you slowly get into it, and you can literally haul, say, I want 8.5 G or 9 G in the stern. You actually do it without looking inside at all. And you look inside later, and you find that you got that 8.5 or 9 that you wanted. And the controls were very light. So it was a pleasure to fly. Very, very light controls like the Hunter. You caressed the controls. You didn't control the aircraft.
You didn't have to manhandle it.
Yeah.
I think to your point, the trick, though, is to take someone who's new and get them to the point where they have that experience. And there's nothing like repetition of flying to get that, because the only way you know what it feels like to pull, like you said, 8.5 or 9 Gs, or to do a level turn or whatever it is you need to do, is by doing it over and over and over again. And it's the same thing for musicians or really anyone who has mastery of anything. And you just have to hope that the young pilots can get to that point without making too big a mistake along the way.
Yeah, but I would say because the aircraft is simpler to fly, it's easier, it's very pilot friendly. If I could do it at a relatively older age, I think the young people can do it too, comfortably.
Well, by the time you had as I'll use your words, relatively older age, you had the benefit of years and years and hours of experience, Harish. So
that is true. That is true.
I won't let you off too easy on that one. Let me ask you this, though. The aircraft was designed, as I understand it, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, for a Soviet pilot who maybe didn't have the autonomy that the West has trusted their pilots with. How did you find the controls for, say, the radar and some of the other systems when you used those in the Indian Air Force? As far as, did you find that they worked okay just with some modifications, or was it a real limitation? But we always thought of fighter pilots in the Soviet era as kind of an extension of someone on the ground.
Well, you're right. I mean, that was the Soviet or the Russian philosophy initially. But the Indians have been operating, as you know, from the beginning with Western aircraft. I mean, we had English and French and all kinds of aircraft. And we were trained differently right from the beginning. So even in the Su-7 or the MiG-21, while we had this ground controller trying to feed you some information of where the target was, and you were just supposed to pilot the aircraft towards that. In the 29, we had a data linking system called the Lazur, and that fed all the threats and whatever you were supposed to engage on your screen. Now, we got that information, but actually we operated far more freely. We took the situation by talking to each other. We didn't have data linking, unfortunately, between aircraft at that time in the 29. which is coming in now, with the Su-30s and the upgraded 29s. It's come, of course, the other aircraft. So we didn't have that, but we had to build up the situational awareness in, in group combat by quick recalls and understanding who's where and what's going on. So we operated far more freely. We exploited the aircraft that way.
Right. So you figure out the boundaries of the equipment, and then you operate them to get the fullest effectiveness.
Absolutely. And a lot of freedom on the pilot, initiative and what he wanted to do.
I mean, just like people, particularly children who play sports, some are taller, some are shorter, some are heavier, lighter, whatever. And each child finds a way to make do with the bodies that they have. And so it's not that much different perhaps, but all right, let's move on to armament.
Okay.
And again, in this case, sometimes there's different terminology, but let's see if we can step through. Let's start with air-to-air, and actually, let's start with a gun. It's got a pretty hefty cannon, a 30 millimeter.
Yeah, 30 millimeter cannon. Yeah, we carried about 150 rounds, and I remember Waldenbach and the other designer, and Beliaco both saying that actually you don't need to carry even 150 rounds because they had tremendous. The gun solution through laser ranging, which was very accurate within, laser is very accurate within a meter or something like that. So it gave you the lead angle pretty accurately as to where you had to aim. And so actually a short burst would get the guy. So they said even 150 is too much, in combat. But we carried 150, a pretty good gun.
Okay. Yeah.
Good, 2 or 3 solutions for gun firing, different kinds.
But it was not a Gatling gun, so the rate of fire was a bit slower.
No,
but with those large rounds, you only needed 1 or 2 hits.
That's it.
Did you ever train to use it in the air-to-surface?
No, we never used the 29 in the air-to-surface role. No.
Not even the gun?
No. Like I said, if I can go back to my hunter experience, we carried...
Yeah.
We had 4 guns there with 135 rounds that we carried, on each. So that's like 540 odd rounds that you carried total. Mm-hmm. Even those days when there were no missiles with us and nothing, and we had to get into combat. And the intention was always to get to, on a high-G maneuvering aircraft, you always had to get, as you would know very well as a fighter pilot, you had to get in within 200-300 yards because otherwise you couldn't hold the lead, if you're further than that. So I snuck up on the Sabre that I was firing at from, up to, I think finally opened my guns at 50 yards. So I fired just about 4 or 5 rounds per gun. I fired a total of 18 rounds from 4 guns, in that combat. So that's a very short burst, and I brought back 520 rounds back. So you actually don't need so many, really, if you aim accurately and if you know what you're doing, not just fire away.
Sure. Did you have any trouble avoiding the damage of the aircraft?
No, luckily didn't get a scratch. Like I said, I've been God's my co-pilot. I always said that. So I never had this.
Fair enough.
Not a scratch on my aircraft on all my missions. Yeah.
All right, so we have the gun. We also have expendables, and these are interesting because they're actually angled forward on the top of the aircraft. Is that right, for the chaff and flares?
Oh, yeah, slightly.
What's the point of that?
Well, they are on top, basically, because you're going to move away. And frankly, if they're too far behind, then the aircraft moves ahead faster, I think. Mm-hmm. So the chaff and flare actually try to cover, when you're traveling, cover part of that distance, and be closer to the aircraft so that you don't get hit, I think.
Yeah, some of the kinematics are a little better if you project it into the wind before it just falls back behind.
Yes.
Okay. All right, let's talk about air-to-air missiles, and we have a couple different kind on the MiG-29. Let's start with the big one, what we would call the AA-10 Alamo. Is that an R7?
R27. The Alamo was the R27. This had 2 versions, actually, that we carried, both the radar version as well as the infrared version, the infrared seeker on top. Mm-hmm. So these were 2 kinds we carried there. Then we had the Archer, as you know, AA-11.
Right.
On the 29, which I actually fired on a practice target when I was training in Russia. So they gave us one, shot. Different people got different, somebody got a gun, somebody got the missile, or someone got the R27 launch. So we all had experience on that. It could also carry the older R60 AFID missile family, the R60 MCA, the improved version, and the others. And now the later versions have in air-to-air have the R77 or the AMRAAMSky, as you call it in the West.
AA-12 Adder, I believe.
That's right. That's right. The AA-12 Adder. We carry that, which came essentially with the MiG-21 biz upgrade, the Bison. Oh. And it moved on to the Sukhoi and the MiG-29 family.
And with the Alamo, as we call it, the AA-10, that particular one has, like you said, basically the same body, but a different seeker. So you can have it either radar guided, similar to an AIM-7 Sparrow, or an infrared.
That's right.
That's pretty impressive. I don't know why they haven't thought of that in the West. I'm sure there's a good reason for it.
I'm sure they got it going somewhere. I was reading about it. I think you've got some of these smaller ones, missiles, not the where you don't have to carry so many, and the F-35 and the others, in the same bay. I was reading about these, what are they called, DART or something like that. It's a smaller missile that you're carrying. It will have different heads. I think people are looking at that, of course, different kinds of heads.
Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah. And then the R-60, like you said, we call that the AA-8 aphid.
That's right.
And then the Archer is the AA-11. And then generally 3 stations on each wing, and then 1 centerline station for the fuel tank. Does that sound right?
That's right, yeah.
And then, of course, the carrier version had, I believe, 4 on each wing.
Correct.
All right. And then for bombs, you already talked about it, general purpose. Was there some forward-firing rockets as well?
Yeah, we had different kinds of rockets. The Russians use 57 millimeter, 80 millimeter, 240 millimeter rockets, and the S-24, as we called it. And we fired that from the early one. It's a huge one. I mean, it's like a bunker buster if you can get it accurately in our guidance.
Oh, geez.
But if you could fire it accurately, it could go through a concrete bunker very easily and go underground.
Okay. Harish, let's move on to performance. You've already talked about the Gs. Is it a 9G limit, you said?
Yes.
Okay. Now, does the airplane stop you, or is it up to you to stop yourself?
Well, it's amazing, actually. Even in Indian conditions, the Indian standard atmosphere is like plus 10 degrees of the Western, the standard atmosphere, as you call it. And here, displaying the aircraft, when we came in, well, you could haul on 9G comfortably and just hold it forever. As a matter of fact, you have to be careful when you move the throttles up with the onset of G. If you move the throttle too fast, you would accelerate, right? And you will go beyond the correct speed for 9G, holding 9Gs. And then the aircraft will keep accelerating. So either you have to come back on the throttle, or you have to hold 10G or something like it. You have to hold more. So the onset of G had to be coordinated with the throttle. And that was the trick that we needed, And quite frankly, in many of the combats with, shall I say, a MiG-29 Biz, when we used to do DACT or those kind of aircraft, hardly ever engaged the burner because you didn't need it, really. You just moved around in dry power. So it could hold 9G forever till you broke your back.
Or ran out of fuel.
Hauling 9G forever, or the aircraft ran out of gas.
Well, we had the Eurofighter Typhoon episode recently, and Enzo, our pilot there, said the exact same thing, Harish. And it's just so foreign to me because in an F-18, as soon as you start pulling it all, it doesn't matter what your left hand is doing, you're bleeding pretty bad.
Yeah.
And it took a long time to get it back. But we also had very good slow speed capabilities. So
that must have been with a lot of load on you. Maybe with full fuel, maybe with a lot of external weapons or whatever you carry. Yeah, I'm talking about in the air-to-air configuration. At takeoff, the 29 had a thrust-to-weight ratio of over 1:1, 1.1:1.
Wow.
In a combat, fuel, 50% internal fuel that we call standard, the thrust-to-weight ratio went to 1.3:1. So
that's impressive.
So we just hold on this kind of G, climb vertically or whatever.
Speaking of that, what was the highest you ever flew on?
In terms of altitude?
Yes.
I've been to about 16 odd kilometers. The aircraft limit is, service ceiling is 18, I think, and absolute ceiling was 21 or 22.
Okay.
I've been to about 16, and you didn't need to go further than that, really.
Okay. So that's almost 10 miles up.
Yeah.
All right. That's pretty high. And what was the fastest you ever had one?
Flying at that altitude is no fun, actually, because you're not, the aircraft is just kind of
I agree.
high Mach numbers and kind of going straight. There's not much you can do.
52,500 feet roughly, which is a little, I've had an F-18 slightly higher, but boy, I was watching that cabin pressure altitude indicator because I did not want to decompress up there. That would not have been good.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. Yeah.
What was the fastest you ever had one?
In air tests, we used to touch 1.8 regularly, 1.8 Mach. Yeah, but I've taken the aircraft up to 2.1, 1.5, yeah.
Maybe on a test flight or...
Yeah, exactly. When you're testing it just to see,
And that's impressive. And so your missions could be high altitude or low altitude, fast or slow, and you really did fly the full spectrum. And
huge envelope depending on who you were supposed to intercept. But at high altitude, the agility of the aircraft didn't come into play really, because now you were out intercepting somebody even higher than you, or about the same level, like you're looking for a SR-71 or a MiG-25 class of aircraft, or a U-2 or something, and snapping up your missile on them or something like that. Frankly, I mean, there was no maneuvering left, really.
Sure. But there was not a lot of air left either. So maneuvering requires air. So, all right. So you've already talked about the ease of flying. What would you say, compared to maybe some of the other aircraft you flew, are some of the strengths of the MiG-29 Fulcrum family?
The agility, certainly, like I said, the thrust-to-weight ratio, the agility and lightness of the controls. Coming from Su-7, I mean, Hunters, I went on to Su-7. The Su-7 was like a great aircraft to fly, very powerful again and very rugged. But it required some force. I mean, I used to come back with what I called a tennis elbow, every time I flew a Su, I mean, I'm like all of 75 kilos now, so I'm not like 200-pounder gorilla or something sitting there. So I found that difficult. The MiG-21 was lighter, but the 29 was really light. It was amazing, absolutely. I mean, actually, I don't remember ever moving the controls to get into a 9G turn. I mean, you kind of willed it and you went into a 9G turn. You hardly moved the surface. It depends on where you're going. Then, of course, I enjoyed the, shall I say, the way it turned on a dime, whether you want to do minimum radius or max rate turn or climb out, or the way it performed. I mean, very carefree maneuvering in terms of when you went into a tail slide or whatever, you didn't have to worry. I mean, even if it didn't do it correctly, it just flicked, and then you had to just neutralize the controls and recover. It recovered very quickly. So very forgiving aircraft, very nice. I would say the cockpit space was much better than the earlier Russian aircraft that I flew. You felt more comfortable. The air conditioning was excellent. In the earlier MiG-21, we just sweat it out completely in the Su-7s at low level, particularly. Here, you could get icicle depending on the temperature you set. So very comfortable.
I never saw a MiG-29 flight demonstration in person. There's plenty of examples on YouTube, but I understand it's quite a show.
Well, it is. I mean, I've got one of my, if you want to go down to YouTube, one of my old shows, a short clip is still there as a wing commander on YouTube. Yeah, so there are many more, I think. I know, but somebody's put it on YouTube, the old ones of 89, I remember.
Okay.
So it's there if you want to watch. And
sure, I'll have to look for it. If you know where it is, if you can send it to me.
I'll send you a link. And if you ever come home and visit me, then I've got those videos or whatever,
I would love to, Harish. Can I consider that an invitation?
Absolutely, anytime.
Well, I can deliver your thank you card in person that way instead of mailing it. So, all right, that sounds
It'd be a lot more fun when we talk, watching the sun go down or whatever. With the sun down, well, you know what I'm saying.
Yeah, I think as much as I'd love to say I could do that someday, it's probably more realistic that you'll come visit me, because you have family here in the States. Is that right?
I got my daughter in San Francisco. I've got people all over, my sister and even my mom.
Well, let me know next time you're here and we'll get you on the show. But we're not, it sounds like we're wrapping up, but we're not. So we were talking about strengths. Are there any weaknesses you're willing to admit with the MiG-29? I can think of one, and that's the smoky engines.
No, I would say one of the most important weaknesses that I pointed out to Mr. Bellico when he came the first time, within 3-4 months of our operating the aircraft, he wanted our inputs on what he could do to improve the 29, and I remember giving him a lot. Smoky engines was one, certainly. But then again, typically, as we are innovative as Indians, what we did was we found a way in combat. The idea was if you opened throttle, in dry power towards the end. So what we did was, whenever we were coming into kind of the visual envelope of 20, 30 kilometers of the other threat, we came in with higher speeds and started throttling back to 3%, 1 or 2%, because we were faster than we should have been. So the smoke stopped, at least for that moment. So till you got into actually an engagement, then it didn't matter if you had smoke or you didn't have smoke. But you didn't want to be spotted first. So we got over that. The other one was the fuel, actually. I always felt that if we had more gas, we could have gone further and done things more, easily, especially when we trained with the Su-30 later when it came in and I was commanding the base. I mean, you had to engage and make sure that you got something out of it or disengage very quickly at distances. The third was the initial problems with the engine and the life, certainly, in terms of internal object damage and FODs and things that we had.
Right.
And the lack of the multi-role capability right in the beginning.
Yes. Uh-huh.
Right in the beginning.
In the beginning, sure.
I mean, they could have made it because the aircraft had the capability, it had the power, it had the stations available, it just required the systems for guidance and the kind of weapons, correct weapons.
It's an aircraft, though, that's been improved upon consecutively, and now they're even calling it the MiG-35. So a lot of these issues are being solved, including, I think, on the latest one, some of the thrust vectoring and the newer technology. So they've really perfected it as much as they can, I would argue.
Yeah, you're right. So I don't know. I mean, you're a fighter pilot. I don't give much weight to thrust vectoring, really, because personally, I think, you're carrying a ton of weight because thrust vectoring requires extra stuff in the back, in the engine. So you're carrying, say, 800 kgs or a ton, literally extra.
Right.
And you're going to use it where? I mean, you're going to use it once in millions, maybe, of engagements.
I never flew with it. I always assumed if the computer needed it and it did it, that's great. But otherwise, it wasn't something I was prepared to do.
Well, I would say today's, particularly in combat, at any time you had to keep your speed. You remember, as a fighter pilot, they always said keep your speed or altitude. Oh, yeah. In thrust vectoring, you really, you maneuver against one aircraft very quickly, but then you bleed off everything and then you take time to recover. And if you're in a group combat, in a large force engagement, as they call it, well, it's not the guy you're fighting with. Somebody else will get you because you're sitting duck at that time. So I'll be very careful of dropping my speed in combat today. At least keep your potential. So that's why I feel, whether it's worth carrying that 1 ton extra all the time.
Right. How about notoriety? In other words, the movie Top Gun made the F-14 famous. Is the MiG-29 famous around the world or in any movies? Is there a demonstration squadron that flies them? Where would the listening public have seen the MiG-29?
Well, I don't think the Russians ever made a movie on it as popular or romantic as Top Gun, quite frankly. Well, the Russians displayed it. I mean, by then they were opening up, so they displayed it in Finland for the first time very quickly, the 29. I think as we got it, the aircraft was already in Finland and later in Farnborough shows and things like that.
Okay.
So it's been displayed around the world because Mr. Belikov and Voldenberg were very keen on selling more and more of them. And, of course, getting a feedback and improving the aircraft as much as they could. So it's not been hidden from the West, really, at all, I would say.
But it's not been necessarily projected, again, like the F-14.
Well, it's not been romanticized. I mean, you need a good lead female for that, and then you need all kinds of...
That's right. Now, in your experience flying the MiG-29, is there one flight that stands out in your mind, either something that happened or unexpected or expected or a particular air show? I mean, when you think back on your 500 hours in a MiG-29, is there one flight that comes to mind?
Well, not really. I mean, I would say some of the DAC sorties that we did with other aircraft, those were the better memorable ones, because you learned a lot yourself and you taught the other side also whatever you wanted to. And I would say, so I wrote, we actually, right in the beginning when we had just about 40, 50 hours on type, less than 100, I think most of us, we were put into an exercise in the Indian Air Force to do comparative performance assessment with the Mirage 2000.
Okay.
And as early as April 1988. And soon after that, I wrote an article and published that called Rivals from the Same Team. So that's also available on the net. Actually, all this is linked in some Hushkit interview that I did. All these articles have been taken by them. Those were, I would say, memorable. Unfortunately, like I said, or fortunately for me, I never had these kind of ejections or flameouts or failures or things like that where you had to go through some rough time. The 29 always, I think it's such a reliable aircraft. It always brought you back. It had redundancy. It had backup systems. You could lose an engine and still do aerobatics on the aircraft if you wish to.
Wow.
So it's that powerful. So it always brought you back, really.
Well, the aircraft, but also the wingman that you said before. So, okay, perfect. Gosh, Harish, this has been a lot of fun. What have we not covered, or what have I not asked you about the MiG-29 Fulcrum that you think the Fighter Pilot Podcast audience needs to know about the airplane?
Well, I would say the 29 has been notorious. You could have asked me, actually, why so many accidents in Russia as well as the other air forces on the 29. And people have lost aircraft and the rate, because like I said, it's so reliable that actually it never lets you down and you can always bring it back. I was very fortunate in my tenure 10, 12 years that I had the 29 with me, and I was either commanding the squadron or the base or whatever later. We never lost an aircraft at all. As a matter of fact, I'm sorry, but I must be immodest and say in 40 years that I've been in the Air Force and instructor for about 35 years, never lost a guy. So even now they are flying in some people are flying airlines, some people are retired very happily. My subordinates that worked with me. Actually, that notoriety was undeserved because I think some of these people have not handled the aircraft correctly or not understood the systems correctly. And most of the accidents, I would say, have been pilot error. So that's sad.
Well, and on that note, if we can go off script for a second,
Sure.
About a year and a half ago, not long after I started this podcast, early 2018, there was a rash of mishaps between the different United States services. And of course, everybody was all up in arms. Oh, it's the training or it's the aircraft, it's this. And I tried to explain that I thought it was frankly a statistical anomaly, that if you throw a handful of coins up in the air, when they land, it's very possible that a few of them will be touching and all be heads. And is that a problem? Well, I think it's just statistics. So India, by some accounts, seems to be having a rather off year. Do you think, is that in fact the case, or is there anything, if it is there anything to point to, or would you also say that flying military aircraft is dangerous and sometimes you're going to have a string of mishaps?
Well, unfortunately, the latter is true, as you say, because, flying combat aircraft, I would say when you say combat, I include, transport and helicopters and altitudes and mountains and that kind of terrain. Combat flying, that's combat. That's military flying. It's not civil flying. It's not autopilot flying or whatever, You have the safe routes and things. So it is full of risks and things will go wrong sometime or the other. Our effort should always be to train to such a level, that people never get into that kind of a situation. They know when to avoid the situations or recover from them. That speaks of the professionalism and the training of an Air Force. I think this year, if you're saying the Indian Air Force, I don't think their rates that I read about in the papers, I'm sitting far away from, the powers that be, or I don't think the rates are much higher than before. But yeah, I mean, I would say a single loss is alarming. Why should we lose one guy at all? I've got a couple of 2,000 missions on the MiG-29, the older ones, and we never lost one there. Why should we lose more modern aircraft today?
Right. And that was a single-engine aircraft, too.
Yeah, absolutely. And didn't have any aids, to recover. You had to do a lot of innovation to fly in bad weather and come back. I mean, we didn't have ILS and we didn't have GPS. We didn't have anything like that.
Well,
we still operated, and we operated in very adverse weather conditions. I give it to my commanders, actually, because I remember some of my commanders used to, when I was a flight lieutenant, they used to push me and say, why are you sitting out? It's raining. Why are you sitting out on the ground? You should be training in this weather. You should be going out and doing things, training other people with you. I thank those people, they took us through, they built us to a level where we could operate in this manner later.
Right. Well, you have to, sweat in training so you don't bleed in war. So.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, Harish, this has been a lot of fun. We only have a couple questions left for you, and I'll thank you for your time at that point. First off, what's the future hold? 40 years of service to your country. Thank you on behalf of your countrymen.
Thank you.
At this point, are you sitting comfortably in a rocking chair and just taking it easy, or are you still keeping pretty busy?
Well, like I said, what I'm doing now is I still try and fly whenever I get the opportunity with friends. And these are all, tiny aircraft. But
sure.
I was very fortunate. I flew the Texan T6G with a friend in the U.S. That's the radial engine one that makes a hell of a noise, if you remember. I flew that till December 17, last time I was there.
Okay.
And earlier, I flew the T6C Texan, too, with Beechcraft guys, So that's a 7G trainer, so I kept flying. But more importantly, now, flying, yes, I'd love to fly whenever I can, but I'm sitting out not in a rocking chair. I sit and try and write things, I'm speaking in public forums once in a while, publishing a few articles here and there, what I think is, should be doing based on my experience. And slowly, I think I'm going to work on a couple of books that I have in mind.
All right. Well, let me just publicly invite you. We have a site our website, we have a page called Musings where I sometimes will write various things, and we're always looking for content. So if you ever find yourself writing something and you're not sure where to submit it, you can always send it to me, and we'll be happy to throw it on our website for you.
Oh, okay.
Great. All right. Well, final question then, Air Marshal Harish Masand. You had told me a couple different call signs you had over the years. Can you say them? Because I might not have pronounced them correctly,
Yeah.
or at least the first one. Fulcrum 1 is easy, but is it Cope?
Well, when I was young and flying hunters in the East and just before the war, people used to give me a nickname called Kappe. That was based on the language and the region I came from. And it was like very affectionate. So in the war, I flew with that call sign as Kappe, because we all became very personalized. And some of the people still call me Kappe, Kapuski, the Russian version of that, or whatever, the real friends. But when I came on the 29, naturally we adopted these call signs, and I became Falcon 1, still known in the Air Force as one of the number one guys on Falcon. So Falcon 1 is the call sign that I would say I retired with finally.
And probably cherished, because that's quite an honor.
Oh, yeah.
For the Indian Air Force to be Fulcrum 1.
Yeah.
Wow. That's cool. Well, I'll just call you Air Marshal, since that's equivalent of the 3-star, as we said before. And
call me Harish, I think is better.
All right, Harish.
Yeah.
Well, this has been a lot of fun. I know the listeners have learned a lot. I certainly did too. Any parting shots before we hang up?
Well, thank you for having me on this show. I think we've talked, but for an aircraft like 29 and for an aviation buff like you and me, not enough. Sometimes we got to do it again and talk some more.
Oh, my.
Like I said, with a sundowner, maybe not for public, but at least between us. Yes, I look forward to that.
Well, next time you're in the States, or if I ever make it to India, we'll definitely do that. But yes, I do conclude many of my interviews saying that we could go on and on and on. And sometimes, by the way, listeners will write and say, hey, don't say you're going to do it. Just do it. We like it.
Sure.
So, but other people try to time their commutes with the show. So we'll leave it at that. I want to thank you very much for your time, sir.
Thank you,
and you have a good rest of your day.
Thank you for having me, and you have a good night. Thank you.
Once again, big thanks to Air Marshal Harish Masand for taking the time to phone in all the way from India to speak with us about the MiG-29 Fulcrum today. What a great interview. Now here to help us process all that is a guest co-host who had a chance to train against the MiG-29 in his FA-18D Hornet. You remember him from episode 26 back in September of 2018 when we discussed the MAGTAF, or Marine Air Ground Task Force. Welcome back, retired U.S. Marine Major Darren Chung. How's it going, Wang?
Hey, Jello, doing great. Thanks very much. It's good to be back.
Excellent. Well, man, it's been a long time. What's new in your world? Last time we saw you, let's see, you were living in the Pacific Northwest and flying for the airlines, as I recall?
Yeah, still living up here, loving flying around the Cascades and the Rockies. Still working for the same airline, having a great time. Family and I are all settled up here. I think we are officially Pacific Northwesters. I got a Subaru Outback, so I guess that's the official state car up here. So I'm in now.
Yep, you are one of them. All right, dude. Well, hey, you're coming back to the show. Thanks very much to help us talk about the MiG-29. Now, before you do, I was just listening to myself before you and I recorded this, and I realized I was really kind of driving the discussion a little bit with the Air Marshal. And I've actually been called out on this on past interviews from people who say, hey, let the guest talk. And, that's a valid criticism. But on the other hand, for this particular show, this being the podcast, there's really certain things I'm trying to get to come out. And so if my guest doesn't say the things that I think maybe are worth mentioning, I sometimes say them myself. So I don't know. What were your thoughts? You listened to it. Did you think I was being a little too forceful?
I think you were going for what we try to get when we're studying an airplane. Okay. And there's great banter back and forth with you and the Air Marshal. But no, I didn't think so. I thought it was great. I learned a lot. And I think I learned a lot because I was kind of getting taught by a Top Gun instructor, which sounds familiar.
There you go. All right. Well, so you've listened to the interview, and man, you got a chance to train against one of these. I never did. A lot of pilots did, but that must have been a dream come true. How and where did you get a chance to fight a Fulcrum, and when was that?
Yeah, so this was spring of 2003. I was on my first deployment with my squadron. We were originally based in Miramar, but we were on what's called a Western Pacific Deployment, or UDP, for the Marine Corps. unit deployment program, and we were on a 2-week detachment in Kuantan, Malaysia, which is on the east coast of Malaysia. And that was, at the time, their MiG-29 base for the Royal Malaysian Air Force.
All right, so you went up for a couple weeks and rubbed shoulders with these guys. Now, first off, on the show before, I've said that, fighter pilots from all over the world are more or less the same, just different accents and insignia on their flight suits. Did you hit it off with these guys, or how was that?
We did. The Royal Malaysian Air Force pilots are phenomenal guys.
Awesome.
And gals. I think they've got a few female pilots flying fighters as well.
All right.
Malaysia's cool because they have sort of a little bit of everything in their Air Force. They fly F-18Ds, the big motors with the 404 engines on the F-18. They fly MiG-29s. They flew the British Hawk. And the Hawk was actually another airplane that was out in Kuantan that we got to fly with. And then more recently, they acquired the, I think it's Su-30, and I forget which version it is. I think it might be the MKK version of the Su-30.
Okay. I think it's the MKM because the first letter M means modified. The second one is export, and the third one is for Malaysia, as I recall. We actually had an article all about this as part of our exclusive content for our Patreon audience. So I'll have to forward that to you. But anyway, all right. So did you get to see all these aircraft on the ramp, or did you get to go out and fight? And what kind of training did you guys do?
Yeah. So when we were there in 2003, they hadn't gotten the Sukhois yet, but they did have the Hawks and the MiG-29s. And when we first got there, it was a 2-week det. We came up from Singapore after 2 weeks in Singapore working with the Sings. The MiGs were actually out of town for a few days, so we got up there. We did some internal squadron training, mostly BFM stuff, basic fighter maneuvers, 1v1, high aspect, offensive, defensive perch sets. Then we did some dissimilar work with the Hawks, which actually had a modified nose because they put a radar in the Hawk so they could do air-to-air combat using, I think, radar missiles and what. So that was kind of interesting. But, we really came up there for, the coup de grace, right? The Mig-29 Fulcrum. They showed up about the end of the first week, and we flew through the weekend and into the next week with them, doing everything from 1v1 offensive, defensive perch BFM to high aspect to 2v2 to include section engaged maneuvering. And I got to do a 2v2 set and a 1v1 set with the MiG-29s, and it was completely awesome.
Very cool. So this was only a couple years after I was the Top Gun SME for threat aircraft. And again, the MiG-29, man, that was it. So you were definitely lucky to have this opportunity. So you heard the interview. I mean, the smoky engines, the maneuverability, the thrust to weight. What was your impression having a chance to swirl with the Fulcrum?
Yeah, so the smoky engines absolutely can attest to that. You could see them as we were approaching the merge. Wow. From a ways off, you could definitely see the engines smoke up as we were across the circle from each other. Most of the stuff that we did were kind of 2-circle tail chases. At least that's the sort of the tactic that they seemed to go with, as opposed to 1-circle radius fight. A lot of afterburners and a lot of high alpha maneuvering. They seemed to not want to do a lot of high alpha. They were doing more energy conservation maneuvers, which was interesting. The interesting thing I noticed from Air Marshal Masand's comments was being able to manage the smoke out of the back of the MiG as they were approaching a merge, so you'd come in with a whole bunch of smash, and then as you're approaching that visual range, which, anywhere inside of about 15 miles or so probably, he would back off on the engines and sort of carry the extra speed, but get the engines cooled off and prevent the smoke from coming out. I thought that was pretty good head work. And, if you think you're going to go fight a MiG-29 and you're expecting that, and when you don't see that, you're really looking for those visual cues, especially out at range, to pick them up. So to have a guy that's savvy with that, boy, is a bummer if you're fighting that guy, but is really cool to hear from another fighter pilot's perspective.
Yeah, no kidding. All right. And then, so if you guys were in a 2-circle fight, that would be, I would think, an opportunity for the Malay pilot to use his helmet mounted sight and AA-11 Archer. Did they train to that? Were they calling shots?
They didn't call a lot of shots. And for that matter, we didn't either. It's not to say that we didn't take the shots. But I think we were trying to get as much time maneuvering against each other as we could. And so you would call a shot, on the ICS for the tapes, and you would squeeze the trigger to get the event marker in the HUD, but you wouldn't necessarily call a shot and a kill because it was just, You wanted the engagement to keep going just to see how you would do.
Right.
It was funny, the two-circle stuff, you hear about, this is what it looks like when you're going from neutral to defensive in a two-circle fight, and you look over your shoulder across the circle and you see this guy marching backwards on your canopy, right? Like towards your 6 o'clock. And holy cow, did you see it with a MiG-29. And we were configured for the fight too. I mean, we took off drop tanks, we took off most of the pylons. So we were as slick as the heavy D with small motors was going to be. And we did a nice job, but the point was made that we do not want to fight somebody else's fight. We want to make them fight our fight if we could.
That is key. All right. And did you guys do any exchange flights? Do they have two-seat MiG-29 UBs or anything?
I don't recall seeing that. We got to walk around the airplanes and kind of climb around on them a bit. I think we took them flying, but I don't recall if they had two-seaters or if it was available. I don't remember us doing that.
Okay. Well, if it was you, obviously you would remember, but you don't know if someone else had the chance or not.
Oh my gosh, would I remember.
All right. Well, good, man. Yeah, we need to follow this up someday with the Su-27 family of flankers, because that's other aircraft that we've always trained against in yours and my career and our eras. And so it's good, just great to hear some feedback from someone who really had a chance to go out and fight against the thing and see it for real. And of course, you guys would, I presume, come into the break and land and go debrief at the club and have a good time, huh?
Oh, yeah. Did we come into the break? 550, almost 600 knots sometimes. It was the wild, wild west. And it felt like, holy cow, I think we're getting to steal something right now. It was absolutely the air-to-air highlight of my flying career, without a doubt, being able to fly with and against a MiG-29.
Wow.
Absolutely the highlight. So I'm really glad that you called me to talk on this one.
Oh, well, you're the perfect guy to follow up, Wang. I really appreciate you being here. I'm insanely jealous. I would have loved to have gone and seen it for myself, but at least we can live vicariously through you. So appreciate you adding that to the discussion today. All right. Well, gosh, I guess that then being said, we're just about out of time. Before wrapping up, we do want to thank always our new Patreon supporters, including our strike leads, Eric Pluven and Lee Wang, who would like to give a shout out to all the candidates and staff from the East Lansing and St. Louis OSOs, as well as Daniel Malmquist. We also have a new mission commander, Daniel Corner, and a new air boss, Andrew King. This is the point in the show where we want to remind the listeners that the views expressed in this presentation are the personal views of the hosts and our guest, and do not necessarily represent the position of the Department of Defense or its components, or the Indian Defense Forces or its components. So Wang, thanks for stopping by, and that was a lot of fun. You definitely helped us better appreciate the MiG-29 Fulcrum.
Had a great time. The last thing I'll say is the two big points that Air Marshal Masand left with me are speed is life, and we shoot big targets.
Very good. Excellent. Well, we can all hang our hats on that and live that for another day. Until then, we'll see you back here next time on the Fighter Pilot Podcast. See ya.
You've been listening to the Fighter Pilot Podcast, brought to you by BVR Productions. Got a question for the show? Send an email to questions@fighterpilotpodcast.com. or leave a message on our listener line at 877-MACH-101. That's 877-622-4101. Be sure to check out our website at fighterpilotpodcast.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. For exclusive Fighter Pilot Podcast content, check out our Patreon page. Please like, follow, and subscribe to the show. And don't forget to share us with your network. Thank you for listening.